A cold wind blew outside the city hospital. The night was quiet except for the soft sound of cars passing by. Under the dim streetlight, a German shepherd lay curled up near the hospital entrance. His fur was thick but covered in dust, and his ears twitched every time the door opened. Nurses on the night shift had noticed him before. Every evening, as the sun set, the dog arrived and settled in the same spot near the emergency doors. He never barked, never begged for food, just waited. Some staff tried to feed him, but he barely sniffed the food before turning away. "Who does he belong to?" a young nurse, Emma, asked as she walked by. "No one knows," replied David, a security guard. "He's been coming here for days, sits there all night and leaves in the morning." Emma knelt down and stretched out her hand. "Hey, boy," she whispered. The dog lifted his head, his deep brown eyes filled with something she couldn't quite understand. Sadness, longing, or maybe hope. But he didn't move closer. People started talking about him. Patients, doctors, visitors. Everyone noticed the dog who waited. Some thought he had been abandoned. Others guessed he was waiting for an owner who never returned. One rainy night, Emma and David stood near the entrance, watching the dog. The rain poured heavily, drenching the streets, but the German shepherd did not move. He simply curled up tighter, his fur soaked, his body shivering. "This is heartbreaking," Emma said. "We can't just leave him like this." David sighed. "I tried to take him home once. He wouldn't budge." Emma frowned. "He's waiting for someone." David nodded. But who? No one had an answer. But one thing was clear. The dog was not going anywhere. And the mystery of his loyalty had just begun. The German shepherd's presence outside the hospital became the topic of conversation among everyone who worked there. Nurses, doctors, patients, and even visitors would glance at him as they passed. His silent, watchful eyes always followed them, but he never moved. Some of the staff tried to figure out who he was. One night, Dr. Maria Lopez, a well-known doctor at the hospital, decided to take matters into her own hands. She had seen the dog every evening for the past week, always in the same spot, never causing any trouble, but never moving away. "That dog is always here," she said one evening to a colleague, Dr. Thomas. "I wonder what his story is." "I've seen him too," Dr. Thomas replied. "He just sits there, like he's waiting for someone." "I'm going to find out who he belongs to," Dr. Lopes said firmly. "Someone must know who he is." Dr. Lopes asked around the hospital. She spoke to everyone from the janitors to the nurses to the security guards, but no one had any answers. People had started calling the dog the Night Watcher because he always appeared when the sun set and disappeared before sunrise. Some even joked that he was part of the hospital's night shift. But no one knew where he came from or why he was so determined to stay there. As the days passed, the mystery deepened. One evening, Emma, the young nurse who had tried to feed the dog, stood outside with David, the security guard, watching the dog's quiet vigil. "I still don't understand it," Emma said, her voice filled with concern. "Why is he always here? I've seen people try to feed him, but he doesn't seem hungry." David shook his head. "I don't know, but I'm starting to think it's more than just being lost or abandoned." "What do you mean?" "Well, think about it. He never leaves. He sleeps in the same spot every night. No matter what the weather is like, he stays. If he was abandoned, I think he'd be more active, more desperate for food or attention. But he's different." Emma nodded slowly. "So you think he's waiting for someone?" David shrugged. "Maybe. But who?" They didn't have an answer. The dog's behavior was unusual. He was too calm, too patient. He wasn't the frantic, hungry stray many would expect to see. He had an air of quiet purpose, as though he knew something that no one else did. One evening, a group of visitors walked by the hospital entrance. They paused when they noticed the dog lying there. One of them, an elderly man, looked at the dog with surprise and then shook his head slowly. "That's strange," the man said, frowning. I think I know that dog. Really? Emma asked, curious. How do you know him? The elderly man nodded. I used to walk this street every day, and I'd often see a man with that dog, a big man, older than me. He had the same breed, a German shepherd, and they were always together. I never saw them without each other. Do you think that's the dog's owner? David asked. I think so, the man replied. But he hasn't been around for weeks. The man, I haven't seen him lately. Emma and David exchanged a look. This was the first real clue they had. He must be waiting for the man, Emma said softly. David agreed. But if that's true, why hasn't he come back yet? The mystery deepened. Who was the dog waiting for? And why was he so determined to stay outside the hospital? The answers seemed out of reach, but one thing was certain. The dog wasn't just a stray. He was a loyal guardian. The German shepherd's nightly presence outside the hospital became even more mysterious as days turned into weeks. The dog, who now had a small group of hospital staff keeping an eye on him, continued his silent vigil. He would sit quietly in the same spot every evening, staring at the hospital entrance as if expecting someone to appear. Dr. Maria Lopez, who had been wondering about the dog's strange behavior, started watching him more closely. She couldn't help but feel that there was more to the story than just a lost or abandoned dog. His loyalty and patience seemed out of place for a stray. Every time she walked past him, she saw how calm and focused he was, and she couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that the dog was waiting for something, or someone, specific. One evening, as Dr. Lopez walked down the hall toward the emergency department, she spotted the German shepherd sitting near the entrance, looking up at the doors. The usual group of nurses and security guards were talking quietly, but Maria wasn't paying attention to them. Her eyes were fixed on the dog. Something about his calm demeanor made her feel as if she was missing a crucial part of the puzzle. She decided to take a closer look. Dr. Lopes went inside the hospital and made her way to the third floor, where some of the most serious patients were being treated. There, she took a moment to check the list of names on the ward. It wasn't long before she found the name she was looking for, Mr. Becker. She had seen his name on the list before. Mr. Becker, an elderly man, had been admitted 2 weeks earlier after collapsing during his daily walk. His condition had been critical at first, but it wasn't getting any worse. He was stable now, but the doctors weren't sure how long he would take to recover. Maria walked down the hall and into Mr. Becker's room. The man lay in his bed, hooked up to several machines that beeped rhythmically. His eyes were closed, and his breathing was slow, but it was steady. As Maria stood there watching him, she remembered what she had been told earlier by a nurse. Mr. Becker had no family. There were no records of relatives, and no one had visited him since his admission. Something clicked in her mind. She quickly left the room and went back to the front entrance of the hospital. The German shepherd was still sitting there, looking up at the hospital doors as though he were waiting for someone. His eyes locked with hers, and Maria felt her heart race. Could this dog be waiting for Mr. Becker? She rushed back to Mr. Becker's room, her mind racing with possibilities. She wanted to ask him about the dog, but he was still unconscious. Maria knew she couldn't wait for him to wake up, so she decided to take a risk. The next morning, after her shift, Maria spoke with the nurses again and asked if they knew anything about Mr. Becker and the dog. After some more questioning, a nurse finally spoke up. "I remember now," the nurse said. "Mr. Becker used to bring that dog to the hospital all the time. His name is Max. They were inseparable. I think Max is the reason Mr. Becker is still alive." Maria was confused. "What do you mean?" "Well, when Mr. Becker first arrived, he was so weak, and we weren't sure if he would make it. But every time Max would come, he would sit by the bed, and Mr. Becker would seem to get stronger. Max always seemed to know when his owner needed him the most." Maria's eyes widened. She suddenly understood. This wasn't just a dog who had been waiting for someone. It was a dog who had been with Mr. Becker through thick and thin. Max had never left his side, even in the most difficult times. Maria was overwhelmed with emotion. She had seen the bond between humans and animals before, but this was something different. This was true loyalty, love, and devotion. Max had been waiting for Mr. Becker, hoping that his owner would wake up. That evening, Maria spoke to the hospital administration and asked if they could make an exception for Max. The hospital had strict rules about animals, but Maria was convinced that Max's presence could make a difference. After a brief discussion, the hospital staff agreed to let Max visit his owner. That night, something magical happened. When Max entered Mr. Becker's room, the dog's eyes lit up. He jumped onto the bed and gently licked Mr. Becker's hand. Maria watched in amazement as Mr. Becker, who had been unconscious for so long, slowly opened his eyes and smiled. It was a small, weak smile, but it was enough. Mr. Becker had woken up, and he wasn't alone. Max was by his side, just like always. The moment Max licked Mr. Becker's hand, the hospital room seemed to fill with a sense of peace. Maria stood quietly by the door, watching the reunion unfold. Max's eyes were filled with a deep, unconditional love, and Mr. Becker, still weak, slowly smiled. It was a small smile, but it was enough to show how much the dog's presence meant to him. Dr. Lopes felt a rush of emotions. She had suspected that Max wasn't just a stray dog. He was something far more important to Mr. Becker. But now, watching the two together, it was clear. This was no ordinary relationship. This was the kind of bond that only happens when two souls are truly connected. Max stayed by Mr. Becker's side all night. The dog lay down next to the bed, his head resting on the floor, but his eyes never left his owner. Mr. Becker's breathing was still slow, but the moment Max was with him, his condition seemed to improve. His heartbeat became steadier, and his body seemed less tense. It was almost as if the dog's presence was giving him strength. The next morning, Maria spoke to one of the nurses about Mr. Becker's condition. "He's showing signs of improvement," the nurse said, smiling. "It's incredible. We weren't expecting him to recover this quickly. We've seen a noticeable difference in his vitals since Max came to visit him." Maria couldn't help but smile. She had seen patients improve in response to therapy and medication, but this was different. Max wasn't just a dog. He was a lifeline for Mr. Becker, a source of hope and love that had been keeping him alive all this time. Later that day, Maria decided to have a conversation with Mr. Becker when he was awake. She gently knocked on the door and entered the room. Max was sitting beside the bed, his eyes watching her closely as she approached. "Hello, Mr. Becker," Maria said softly. Mr. Becker turned his head slowly, his eyes still a little cloudy from his time in the hospital, but they brightened when he saw her. "Hello, doctor," he whispered, his voice raspy. "How are you feeling today?" Maria asked gently. "Better," he replied, looking at Max with gratitude. "I feel stronger. Max is here." Maria nodded. "I see. I wanted to ask you about him. How long have you and Max been together?" Mr. Becker's face softened, and he looked down at Max. "We've been together for years. Max came into my life when I was lonely. I adopted him from a shelter when he was just a puppy. We've been inseparable ever since. He's my best friend, my family." Maria listened carefully, her heart growing heavier with every word. "I don't know what I would have done without him," Mr. Becker continued. "When my wife passed away a few years ago, I didn't think I could keep going. But Max was there. Every day, he was by my side. He gave me something to live for. He kept me going, even when it seemed like everything else had fallen apart." Tears welled up in Maria's eyes as she listened to the truth. She had suspected that Max was special, but she hadn't realized just how much he had been a lifeline for Mr. Becker. It was more than just companionship, it was survival. Max had been the one thing keeping Mr. Becker from giving up. "Max saved my life more times than I can count," Mr. Becker said softly, his voice filled with emotion. "And I think he's saving me again." Maria's heart ached for Mr. Becker, But she also felt deeply moved by the love and loyalty between him and his dog. It was a reminder that love, whether it's from a human or an animal, can be the greatest healing force of all. Max's devotion had kept Mr. Becker alive, and now it seemed like the dog's love might help him heal completely. As the days went by, Mr. Becker's recovery continued to improve. Max stayed with him, sitting by his side during every visit, never leaving. The bond between them was undeniable, and it was clear that the dog's presence was playing a major role in Mr. Becker's healing process. The staff continued to be amazed by the transformation they saw in Mr. Becker, and it was hard to deny that Max was the reason for it. Maria visited Mr. Becker and Max every day. She would stand in the doorway and watch as Max curled up at his owner's feet, as though guarding him from the world. The love between them was palpable, and it gave Maria hope for the future. In a world that often felt too busy and too cold, the story of Max and Mr. Becker was a reminder that sometimes the strongest bonds are the simplest, and that love, in all its forms, has the power to heal even the deepest wounds. The days passed slowly, and each day Mr. Becker's health seemed to improve just a little bit more. The doctors were amazed. His condition, which had once seemed hopeless, was now showing signs of hope and recovery. But it wasn't just the medicine that was working. There was something else at play, something that couldn't be explained by science alone. Max, the loyal German shepherd, never left Mr. Becker's side, and his presence seemed to be the key to his recovery. The staff noticed it too. Every time Max sat next to the bed, Mr. Becker seemed stronger. The nurses and doctors couldn't deny that Max had become an important part of the healing process. One afternoon, Dr. Lopes walked into Mr. Becker's room and was greeted by the sight of Max lying on the floor beside the bed. Mr. Becker was sitting up, holding a cup of water, his face looking more alive than it had in weeks. Maria smiled as she approached the bed. "I'm feeling better, Doctor," Mr. Becker replied, his voice still a bit weak but full of hope. "I feel like I can finally breathe again. And it's all thanks to Max." Dr. Lopes nodded. "I've been noticing that you're improving. Your heart rate is steadier, your breathing is easier, and your strength is coming back. It's amazing to see." Mr. Becker looked down at Max, who was gazing up at him with an unwavering loyalty. "I don't think I'd still be here without him. Max has been my lifeline. He's kept me going when everything else felt impossible." Maria's heart swelled with emotion. She had seen many patients come and go, but there was something truly special about the bond between Max and Mr. Becker. It was more than just a pet and his owner. It was a deep connection that no one could deny. In many ways, Max had saved Mr. Becker's life. Just as she was about to say something more, one of the nurses entered the room. "Dr. Lopez," the nurse said, "I think you should see something. The doctor in charge of Mr. Becker's care wants to speak with you." Dr. Lopes looked at Mr. Becker for a moment. "I'll be right back," she said, giving him a reassuring smile before leaving the room. When she entered the hallway, the doctor was waiting. "Maria, we've been going over Mr. Becker's case, and we've made an unusual discovery. His vitals are improving at a rate we didn't expect. His recovery is beyond what we thought was possible." Dr. Lopes raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" The other doctor looked serious. "Well, we know that people can sometimes recover quickly if they have a reason to live, something to fight for. In Mr. Becker's case, we thought it was just the right treatment, the right medicine, and time. But now I'm starting to think it's something else." Maria frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" The doctor hesitated for a moment. "I believe Max is the reason Mr. Becker is recovering so quickly. The dog's presence is keeping him alive. It's more than just companionship. There's something deeply healing in that bond." Maria's heart skipped a beat. She had suspected as much, but hearing another doctor say it out loud made it feel even more real. "I think you're right," she said quietly. "Max isn't just a dog. He's Mr. Becker's reason to keep fighting. He's more than just a companion. He's his lifeline. The doctor nodded slowly. It's incredible to think about. But it's clear that Max is helping him heal. It's hard to deny the connection between them. Maria smiled, her eyes filling with tears. She had always believed in the power of love, but she had never seen it quite like this. The bond between Max and Mr. Becker was truly something extraordinary. It wasn't just the physical healing that mattered. It was the emotional support, the love, and the hope that Max provided. After their conversation, Maria returned to Mr. Becker's room, feeling a renewed sense of understanding. She walked in to find Max sitting by Mr. Becker's side, his head resting on the bed. Mr. Becker looked up at her, his face full of gratitude. "I'm so glad to see you looking better, Mr. Becker," Maria said softly, smiling warmly at him. "Thank you, doctor," he replied. "I wouldn't be here without Max." "I know it." Maria nodded. "I think you're absolutely right. Max has given you something that no medicine can. His love, his loyalty. It's all part of what's helping you recover. It's incredible." Mr. Becker's eyes filled with tears. "I never thought a dog could do so much. He's more than I ever imagined." Max lifted his head and looked up at Mr. Becker, his eyes filled with trust and love. It was as though the dog knew what they were talking about, and he seemed to be proud of the bond he shared with his owner. Maria stood in the doorway, watching the two of them, and she realized that love, in all its forms, was one of the most powerful healing forces in the world. Max had shown her that sometimes the most extraordinary things can come from the simplest of bonds. As the days turned into weeks, Mr. Becker's recovery continued to amaze the hospital staff. Every morning, Max would lie next to his bed, his head resting on the floor, watching his owner with quiet, loving eyes. The doctors were shocked by how quickly Mr. Becker's health had improved, and no one could deny that Max's constant presence was the key to it all. Maria Lopes couldn't stop thinking about the bond between Max and Mr. Becker. It was like a miracle, something she had never seen before in all her years of practicing medicine. The love between the two was so powerful, so pure, that it seemed to have the ability to heal wounds that medicine alone couldn't reach. One morning, as Maria entered Mr. Becker's room for her daily checkup, she was greeted by a surprising sight. Mr. Becker was sitting up in his bed, fully awake and smiling. He had gained back much of his strength, and was no longer the fragile, sick man he had been when he first arrived at the hospital. "You're looking great, Mr. Becker," Maria said, smiling brightly. "How are you feeling today?" Mr. Becker beamed. "I feel like a new man, doctor. I feel stronger every day. And it's all thanks to Max. I don't know what I'd have done without him." Max, who was lying at Mr. Becker's feet, lifted his head at the sound of his name. He wagged his tail slowly, as if to agree with his owner's words. It was clear that Max had become more than just a pet. He was a symbol of hope, a true companion who had helped bring Mr. Becker back from the brink of despair. Maria couldn't help but feel moved by the sight of the two of them together. It was as if they had saved each other. Max had given Mr. Becker the will to live, and Mr. Becker had given Max a life full of love and care. Together, they were a perfect team. "I've been thinking a lot about how much Max has done for me," Mr. Becker continued, his voice filled with emotion. "When my wife passed away, I didn't know how I was going to keep going. I felt like everything had fallen apart. But Max was always there. Every day, he was there to keep me company, to make me smile, even when I didn't feel like smiling." Maria smiled softly. "It sounds like Max has been your rock." Mr. Becker nodded. "He has. I owe him my life. Really. And I know that I'm not the only one who's been helped by the love of a dog. Max has shown me just how powerful the bond between us can be." The conversation was interrupted by a knock on the door. The nurse entered with a big smile on her face. "Dr. Lopez, I have some good news for Mr. Becker. The results of his latest tests just came in, and they're all looking great. His heart function is improving, and his lungs are stronger than ever." Maria felt a wave of relief wash over her. "That's wonderful news, Mr. Becker." He smiled, looking down at Max. I think it's because of Max. I don't think I'd be here today if it weren't for him. He's been my reason to fight. He's been my strength when I had none. Maria felt tears well up in her eyes. She had seen countless patients come and go, but there was something so special about this story. The bond between Max and Mr. Becker wasn't just about companionship. It was about survival, hope, and the incredible power of love. As the days went by, the hospital began to plan for Mr. Becker's release. He had made such a miraculous recovery that they felt confident he would be able to go home soon. The hospital staff was thrilled by his progress, but there was one thing that they all agreed on. Max would be with Mr. Becker every step of the way. On the day Mr. Becker was scheduled to leave the hospital, the staff gathered in the lobby to say their goodbyes. Everyone had heard the story of Max and Mr. Becker's incredible journey, and they were all moved by the love and loyalty between the two. Maria stood by the door, watching as Mr. Becker and Max prepared to leave. Max, with his head held high and his tail wagging, was ready to go home. He had been Mr. Becker's constant companion, and now, it seemed, he would continue to be by his side as they both moved on to the next chapter of their lives. Before leaving, Mr. Becker turned to Maria, his eyes full of gratitude. Thank you, Dr. Lopes, for everything. You've given me more than just medical care. You've given me hope, and I'll never forget that. Maria smiled, her heart full. It's been an honor to help you, Mr. Becker, but the real credit goes to you and Max. You've both shown us what true love and loyalty can do. With that, Mr. Becker and Max left the hospital, ready to begin their new life together. And as Maria watched them walk away, she knew that their story wasn't just a heartwarming tale. It was a reminder that love, in all its forms, can heal even the deepest wounds. Weeks passed since Mr. Becker left the hospital with Max by his side. The two of them had settled back into their home, a small but cozy house on the edge of town. The house, which once felt empty and lonely, was now filled with warmth and life, thanks to the bond between the elderly man and his loyal dog. Life for Mr. Becker had changed dramatically. He was no longer the frail, weak man who had been admitted to the hospital, unsure if he would make it. Thanks to Max, he had found the strength to keep going. Now he was able to walk around the house, take care of himself, and even enjoy a few quiet moments in his garden. Max had not only brought hope into Mr. Becker's life, but he had also given him a sense of purpose. Every morning, Max would wait by the door, wagging his tail eagerly, as if ready to face the day with his owner. And Mr. Becker, who once spent most of his days in sadness and isolation, now found joy in caring for his dog. One sunny afternoon, as Mr. Becker sat on the porch, enjoying the breeze, he heard the sound of a car pulling up the driveway. Looking up, he saw a familiar face. It was Dr. Lopes, the doctor who had helped him during his hospital stay. Dr. Lopes. Mr. Becker called out with a smile. What a pleasant surprise. Maria smiled as she stepped out of her car and walked toward the porch. I was in the neighborhood and thought I'd stop by to check on you, she said warmly. How are you feeling? I'm feeling great, thanks to Max, Mr. Becker said, giving the dog a pat. Max, who was lying next to his owner, looked up at Dr. Lopes with a wag of his tail. I don't know what I'd have done without him. He's been my reason to keep going. Maria smiled, her heart swelling with emotion. I'm so glad to see you both doing so well. You've come a long way since you were in the hospital. Mr. Becker nodded. It's been a journey, that's for sure. But Max has been there every step of the way. He's given me more than I could ever repay. I just hope that, somehow, I've been able to give him the same kind of love he's given me. Dr. Lopes looked at the two of them, feeling deeply moved. She had seen many patients in her career, but there was something different about Mr. Becker and Max. Their bond was something extraordinary, something that went beyond the typical relationship between an owner and a pet. It was a bond that had saved both of their lives, in its own way. As they talked, Maria noticed that Max seemed to be more energetic than ever. He was still the calm and gentle dog he had always been, but there was a sparkle in his eyes that suggested he was thriving in this new chapter of life. Max was not just a companion for Mr. Becker. He had become a symbol of hope for both of them. "Has Max been keeping you busy?" Dr. Lopes asked, smiling as Max trotted around the yard. "Oh, he keeps me on my toes." Mr. Becker chuckled. "He's always up for a walk, and he's still as playful as ever. Sometimes I can't keep up with him." They both laughed, enjoying the peaceful moment together. It was a sharp contrast to the heavy, lonely days Mr. Becker had spent before Max entered his life. The dog had breathed new life into Mr. Becker's world. As the afternoon passed, Dr. Lopes looked at her watch. "I should probably get going, but I just wanted to check in and see how you were doing." Mr. Becker stood up and walked over to Dr. Lopes, his heart full of gratitude. "Thank you, Doctor. I don't think I'll ever be able to express how much you've helped me. You gave me the chance to live again, but it was Max who gave me the will to keep fighting." Maria smiled warmly. "You did the hard part, Mr. Becker. You found the strength to keep going. Max was just there to help you along the way. You both have an incredible story." Before Dr. Lopes left, Mr. Becker made a promise. "I want to share my story with others. I want them to know about the bond Max and I share. Maybe it will help someone who's struggling, just like I was." Maria's eyes softened. "I think that's a beautiful idea. Your story can inspire others to believe in the healing power of love and loyalty." As Dr. Lopes left the house, she looked back at the man and his dog sitting together on the porch. She felt a sense of peace, knowing that Mr. Becker and Max had found a new beginning, one filled with hope, companionship, and healing. Max had not only saved Mr. Becker's life, but in a way, Mr. Becker had saved Max's too. Together, they had created a bond that would last for a lifetime. Months had passed since Mr. Becker had returned home from the hospital, and life had settled into a comfortable routine. Every day was a gift. He spent his mornings tending to his small garden, his afternoons enjoying long walks with Max, and his evenings reflecting on the incredible journey that had brought him here. Max, always by his side, seemed more content than ever, his once weary eyes now shining with joy. One afternoon, as Mr. Becker sat on the porch, watching Max chase a squirrel across the yard, he thought about the promise he had made to Dr. Lopes. He knew that he wanted to share his story with others, to let people know how a dog's love had saved him when he had no strength left to fight. He had never been one for attention, but he understood that his experience could offer hope to others who were facing tough times. A few days later, Mr. Becker decided it was time. He called Dr. Lopes and asked her if she could help him organize a small talk at the local community center. The idea was simple. He wanted to tell people about how Max had been his lifeline, how the bond between a man and his dog had pulled him through the darkest days of his life. Maria was more than happy to help. She knew how powerful Mr. Becker's story was, and she was excited to see how it could inspire others. Together, they worked on setting up a small event. Nothing too fancy, just a chance for people to gather and hear about the amazing journey of Mr. Becker and Max. On the day of the event, Mr. Becker was nervous. He had never spoken in front of a crowd before, and the thought of sharing such a personal story made him feel vulnerable. But he knew it was important. As he stood in front of the small crowd at the community center, Max by his side, he took a deep breath and began. "I never thought I'd be standing here today." Mr. Becker began, his voice shaking slightly at first. "There was a time when I didn't know if I'd make it another day. When my wife passed away, I felt like I lost everything. I was empty. But then there was Max, my dog, and he didn't just bring me company. He gave me a reason to keep going." The crowd listened intently, many of them nodding in understanding. Mr. Becker continued, sharing the story of his illness, his recovery, and the deep bond he had with Max. He talked about how Max had been there for him every step of the way, how the dog's love and loyalty had helped him fight against the odds. "As I sit here today," Mr. Becker said, looking around the room, I realized that Max didn't just save my life. He showed me what it means to love unconditionally. And he taught me that no matter how hard life gets, there's always a reason to keep going. Tears welled up in his eyes as he spoke. Max, sensing the emotion, walked over and laid his head on Mr. Becker's knee. The room fell silent, and for a moment, everyone felt the power of that simple, yet profound gesture. It was clear to everyone that the bond between them was something truly special. When Mr. Becker finished his story, the room erupted in applause. People came up to him afterward, thanking him for sharing such an inspiring and heartfelt tale. Many were touched by the way a dog's love had brought healing and hope to a man who had once lost everything. That evening, as Mr. Becker and Max returned home, Mr. Becker felt a sense of peace he hadn't known before. He had shared his story, and in doing so, he had not only honored Max, but also given others hope. He felt proud of what he had accomplished and knew that he had made a difference. Max, as always, was by his side. The dog seemed to know that their journey wasn't just about survival. It was about spreading love, showing others the power of loyalty, and reminding everyone that sometimes the most extraordinary healing comes from the simplest places. As the sun set that night, casting a warm golden light over the yard, Mr. Becker sat back in his chair and looked at Max, who was lying at his feet. They had both been through so much, but they had come out stronger on the other side. Together, they had created a legacy of love that would live on in the hearts of those who had heard their story. And as Max looked up at him, his eyes filled with trust and affection, Mr. Becker knew that no matter what the future held, they would always face it together.